This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Can you imagine Connecticut's marshes, shores, and wetlands without the graceful beauty of our long-legged wading birds, cautiously hunting the shallows for small fish and other aquatic life? That question was poetically posed by the Connecticut Audubon Society's Senior Director of Science and Conservation in the latest State of the Birds report. While local populations of wading birds like herons and egrets have rebounded since they were decimated by hunters at the turn of the last century, their status today is precarious. Today on Where We Live, we'll hear from several experts on the front lines of bird conservation, from wading and beach nesting birds to birds of prey. For so many species, human disturbance and land development are a continual threat. Plus, some good news. Raptors are back on the rise in Connecticut. Deep wildlife biologist Brian Hess will join us to discuss. First, to help us dig into the new State of the Birds report is Patrick Cummings, Executive Director of the Connecticut Audubon Society, and Milan Bull, Senior Director of Science and Conservation for the Connecticut Audubon Society. Thanks both of you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Catherine.
Amateur bird watchers, we want to hear from you too. What are you seeing where you live? You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Patrick, I want to start the conversation with you in terms of the big picture. The report was titled 125 Years of Bird Conservation Through Local Action, celebrating 125 years of Connecticut Audubon Society and the impact of the conservation efforts it has led. Can you take us back to the Society's origin story and the fact that it sounds like women's fashion was a huge part of that?
Sure. This report was our, I think, 16th report. The State of the Birds report. We began our State of the Birds report in 2006, and this year, coinciding with the 125th anniversary of the Connecticut Audubon Society, we wanted to look at broad issues that spanned the entire period from 1898 to the present. And if we had a time machine and were to get back into get into a time machine and go and talk about bird conservation in 1898, certainly the topic of fashion would be high on our list.
It was. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Continue.
Okay. The bird conservation movement started in the 1880s and 1890s, specifically as a way to stop the slaughter of birds by hunters in New York's fashion houses. It was fashionable for birds and birds' feathers to adorn ladies' hats.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's really fascinating that was sort of the crux of why it happened. And I can actually see the fashion walking down the streets during that era. And Miley, you head up conservation at the Audubon Society, and your portion of the latest report was focused more on wading birds like herons and egrets. At the turn of the last century, you wrote, there were more egrets adorning ladies' hats than in the wild. So echoing what Patrick was just saying, can you talk to us about that initial conservation effort and the far-sighted women who led it?
Yeah, certainly. At that time, the millinery trade was exceedingly active, and it was very profitable to put bird feathers on ladies' hats. Anybody who's gone back in the history of photographs, probably your great grandmothers, excuse me, would have shown ladies' hats adorned with feathers. And the most popular of those feathers were the egrets, which were the long lace-like feathers from the egret's backs on the interscapular area of the birds. And I believe that's what started the whole fashion movement towards putting birds on bird feathers on ladies' hats. Well, they became so valuable and so popular in the fashion industry that bird hunters were especially set out to collect these egret feathers, and the only time these egrets produce these specialized feathers is in the breeding season. And so the millinery trade would go into these very large colonies of nesting egrets and wipe them out. And so when they're killing the adults, they also would kill the young ones, because the young ones would starve once they shot the adults off the nest. No population of birds can take that kind of situation for very long without becoming close to extinction. And basically that's what happened. So by the 1880s, 1890s, these egrets and other shorebirds, wading birds, became nearly extinct. Whereas they were found at one time, from the south all the way up to Maine. By the time 1888 or so came to pass, they were very, very rare in Connecticut. And fortunately now, with the passage of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, they've slowly began to recover. But yeah, that's true. At one time, there were more egrets on people's hats than there were in the wild.
And I think it's difficult to imagine, especially today, that that's sort of what started this whole thing, and the fact that fashion has such a large impact. And I'm trying to picture, there must be a huge need. I mean, that's a lot of feathers, basically. Where do things stand today for wading birds? I understand that I think 846 was the peak of the state's population.
Yeah, well, today the wading bird population nesting in the state is teetering. It's trying to recover, but interestingly, these wading birds nest in colonies, which means they nest together in a group, and they need protection from predators. So over time they've evolved to reproduce on offshore islands, undeveloped offshore islands, that are the most protected from predators. And since, as you can imagine, there's not too many undeveloped offshore islands left in Connecticut, but there are a few. And so we do have about 5 islands off the coast of Connecticut that support about 5 species of wading birds that are nesting there. But they're under threat. They're under threat by human disturbance, still by predators. Raccoons can still swim out to these islands. White-tailed deer can get out to the islands and reduce the nesting cover, the habitat that these birds need to nest in. So, yeah, they are very well protected, but under threat.
And I think Duck Island in Westbrook is one of the sanctuary for these birds. Can you talk to us in a little bit more detail about what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. Duck Island off Westbrook is one of the Sound's sort of rare undeveloped islands. It's about 5.5 acres, and it's a state-owned wildlife management area, which means the state of Connecticut, the DEEP, protects that island. It's got these 2 long breakwaters extending north and west, and it's actually listed by the Audubon Society as an important bird area. And right now, it's one of the largest heronries in the eastern half of the Sound. There's probably about 55 pairs of 5 different species of wading birds that are nesting here. Basically, in the structure, it's got a very dense structure of vegetation, which they need for protection. So yeah, so Duck Island is one of our great success stories for wading bird nesting.
And you mentioned that raccoons and white-tailed deer are destroying a lot of the breeding habitats. And I think some of the habitat restoration is also ongoing at Charles Island in Milford, which has seen a decreasing numbers of egrets because of the reasons you've said just now. Can you tell us more about that effort in particular?
Yeah, Charles Island is a little different than some. It's undeveloped, but there's a long tombolo, a sandbar that goes out to the island at low tide. So people can get out there. White-tailed deer can walk out. Raccoons can get out. But some of the recent storms we've had out there have decimated the structure that these birds need to nest in, which is the trees and shrubs that these bird colonies need. And so the state has been doing a really good job of trying to restore this island into a good heronry again. they're protecting it. They fenced it from deer. They're keeping people off of it, and they're replanting the structure that these birds need to nest in. So we'll see. Right now, there's a few birds nesting there, but we're pretty much optimistic that this can become a very active heronry again.
Well, I'm glad for that optimism on this Monday morning, talking about a very interesting topic here. You mentioned that it is rare to find undeveloped islands for these birds to nest. And so can you give listeners a sense of how central an issue human disturbance and land development are when it comes to wading birds? Where do they usually nest?
Yeah, well, it's probably the most important situation that these wading birds nest in. It's human disturbance. we have a ways to control the predators. We can move the raccoons and the deer off the islands, but there's a huge number of boating recreationalists that are up and down the coast, and of course they like to land on the beach, and have their picnics, to walk through the forests or the habitat if there's no one living there, and they bring their dogs, and all this has a big effect on the wading birds. They need to be away from people, away from predators, away from dogs, and they need heavy structure in order to nest in. So probably the human disturbance is one of the primary issues that we're facing, but that's something that we can, if collectively, that's something that we can all work on as well. We like to put up warning signs. This is a bird nesting area. Please keep out. If it's a state-owned property or private-owned property, we can fence it from people. So we can do this. This is not impossible. So I think that as I said, the overall situation is optimistic if we keep working on it.
And Patrick, I want to bring you back to this real quick. What else would you add to the front of human disturbance?
Well, these areas aren't exactly places that are pleasant to go to. They're interesting, but there are all sorts of poison ivy. There's all ticks galore out there, including the Lone Star tick. So really, from a human health and safety perspective, it's best to avoid these areas as well. And the ticks can carry diseases that can affect our dogs as well. So although it may be interesting and novel to go out and think, I'm going to go visit the heron rookery, or I'm going to go look for Captain Kidd's treasure. Going out to these islands is not exactly pleasant or safe.
Well, you had me at treasure real quick, but then ticks galore is also going to help me not want to go to those areas and leave those birds in peace. Can you also just do you have anything more specific as well in terms of what humans do to disturb those properties in terms of land development, or like what Miley was saying earlier? People like to go picnic or land their boats there. Anything else that you can think of?
Yeah, I think it's it's a matter of these birds in some parts of the world will nest on the mainland where the habitat's right for them, like in the Everglades, where there's these sort of forests that are hummocks that are above the marsh. So in a sense, marsh islands. And but we're so highly developed up here in the Northeast that in a sense, these birds have been pushed to the undeveloped islands, and it's with what few islands are remaining, even if there aren't island birds nesting there currently at this time, they offer the potential of future nesting colonies. These colonies tend to be ephemeral in general, just by their nature, because they're so susceptible to predation. and disturbance. So in a natural and a perfect situation, there would be, say, 10 islands, and 5 of them which would be inhabited at any given time. And as deer or raccoons or humans would disturb an island, they'd move to a new island. Unfortunately, we have only a finite number of islands here in Long Island Sound, and even lower number of which have the proper vegetative structure. So we have to, in a sense, protect them a little bit more than we would under a perfect situation if the human disturbance was not an issue, if the deer browsing hadn't already altered the vegetative structure on these islands, if all of the mainland nesting sites hadn't already been encroached upon by development.
Well, speaking of a perfect moment, Sharon on Facebook just shared with us that she was a crossing guard in Rocking Hill. And one morning, about 2 weeks ago, she was crossing kids at Griswold Middle School and saw the most majestic bald eagle soaring right over us. Thank you so much, Sharon, for sharing that. And I want to turn it back to Miley. You're also the Dean of Connecticut Conservationists. What are your concerns in terms of the big picture?
I'm also the what?
The Dean of the Connecticut Conservationists?
Oh, wow. I've just been elevated beyond my status. The Dean of Conservation. Wow. Patrick, I hope that results in a pay raise somewhere down the line, but never mind. We'll talk about that later. But what was I got so interested in being the Dean. I forgot what your question was.
Well, apologies if that was an inadvertent promotion, but really just want to get your perspective on what are some of your concerns in terms of the big picture.
Well, the big picture, the populations of birds and other animals, but specifically birds, they ebb and flow. It's, both in species and diversity. But gradually the ups and downs are heading downward. And that's obviously because of the human population is increasing. People need places to live, need places to work, and need places to shop. And so development is increasingly fragmenting habitat for all bird species, not just in Connecticut in the US, but around the world. And so what's happening is there's fewer and fewer places, large wild landscapes for bird populations to thrive. And this results in these small fragmented areas. I mean, a lot of people have been watching the Yellowstone series, but if you take Yellowstone National Park, for instance, in reality, that's just a tiny little dot in the on the earth for habitat. And as these habitats shrink and become tinier, smaller and smaller islands, naturally you're going to get diversity and abundance of birds and other species to decline. And so that's the biggest threat that we're facing is, we can protect national parks, state parks, wildlife areas, Audubon sanctuaries, but in the large landscape scale of things, it doesn't really have a big impact on the overall diversity and abundance of birds.
Well, thanks so much for that, Miley.
Did that make any sense?
Yes, it did. It did, absolutely.
Okay.
And I know we appreciate that perspective. And from Connecticut Public Radio, this is Where We Live. I'm Catherine Shen. We just heard about the conservation efforts to offset the fading of wading birds in Connecticut. Coming up next, we'll get a little closer to the shore and hear about beach nesting birds from Audubon, Connecticut. What have you observed where you live? You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. American oystercatchers, like many beach nesting birds where we live, are threatened by climate change and habitat loss. Whether the piping plover, the least or common tern, the willet, or semipalmated sandpiper, all require continual vigilance to maintain and increase their populations. Researchers estimate that the population of North American shorebirds have declined 73% since 1970s because of habitat loss and unregulated hunting in their Central and South American wintering grounds. That's according to Elizabeth Amendola, Coastal Program Coordinator for Audubon, Connecticut. She joins us now. Thanks so much, Elizabeth, for joining us.
Hi, good morning. Thank you.
And still with us is Patrick Cummins, Executive Director of the Connecticut Audubon Society. Bird watchers, you can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Beth, can you talk to us about the status of conservation efforts for Connecticut's beach nesting birds, and why are they particularly vulnerable?
Yeah, so our beach nesting birds are very vulnerable. As you know, Connecticut's coastline, we don't have many available beaches for these birds to nest on, and we share them with lots of beachgoers that like to enjoy the shore as well. These birds lay their eggs directly in the sand, and their tan and gray eggs with, black and brown speckles will blend right in, and they're very difficult to see and very easy to be stepped on. So here in Connecticut, we try to protect these areas. We put up fencing just to alert folks that, we do have birds nesting here, just try and give them a little space so that they can breed here in the summer.
It's so fascinating to be having this conversation just because I'm familiar with the snowy plovers in the California coastline where we were, as humans, fenced out and not allowed to go to the beach in the summers, but it is important to stay off their habitats. So can you help us distinguish the threats of human intervention in terms of, whether it's disturbances or just outright land development and climate change?
Well, actually, all three of those, topics are, have a big impact on these birds' populations. So yes, human disturbance, even just, general beach going, folks walking down the beach, this will, scare the birds off their nests. Coastal development is reducing the amount of available nesting habitat for these birds. And climate change is also having a very large impact. We're seeing the increase of severe coastal storms. And what this does is it will wash over these beaches and it will wash out these nests. And in some cases, even take very young chicks. So they're very susceptible to all these threats.
Is there one in particular that has more threat than others?
Well, I think human disturbance really has a huge impact on these birds, but I think that threat is something that we really can work to try and reduce. Keep your dogs off the beaches. When these birds see our sweet little pets that are a member of the family, they see it as a predator. They see it as a fox or a coyote coming to eat their chicks or their eggs. So it really has a detrimental impact on these birds. And just giving birds space. These are things we can do. Removing your garbage from the beach. Garbage that we leave on the beach will attract predators like raccoons and gulls that also will feed on chicks and eggs. So there are simple steps that we can do to give these birds space to ensure that they can nest successfully.
And what are the other shorebirds we are referring to when we say beach nesting birds? We're talking, piping plovers, American oystercatchers, and terns, as well as invasive species.
Well, here in Connecticut, we do all those species you just mentioned. So our oystercatchers, our piping plovers, we have least terns and common terns. The common terns tend to nest on our offshore islands with many of our oystercatchers. And on our mainland beaches, we see our piping plovers, our least terns, and our American oystercatchers. These areas, those are nesting species, but these areas are also very important for our migratory shorebird species. They come here in the spring and fall during their migration, and they really share these areas with our beach nesting birds to rest and feed. It's a little stopover for them on their long journeys.
I was actually going to ask if you can explain how important are the migratory patterns and the work that you do to identify these sort of key staging areas and the stopovers that you just mentioned.
So yeah, these, as I said, these areas are very important. We'll have flocks of, at times thousands of birds in, a few select areas in Connecticut where these birds can rest and feed. Here in Connecticut, we've actually started putting colored bands on American oystercatchers. These bands are easy to see. You can see them with binoculars or a camera, and you can read the code. What these bands are doing is they're helping us to understand these birds' movements. So during the season, we can see which birds come back, where they're nesting. And then at the end of the season, they move to these areas we call staging areas, where the birds will group up together in a large group. They'll hang out and feed for a couple months, building energy reserves before they migrate south. And when these birds end up in their wintering grounds, people are also seeing their colored bands on their legs. And by reporting those, we're getting a better understanding of where these birds are going and the other areas that need to be protected. It's not just their nesting areas and their stopovers. We also need to look along, through the Americas and Central America, the areas these birds are using in the winter as well.
And you've also looked at the correlations between urbanization and invasive species like starlings, but you found that the attributing cause and effect is complex. Can you break that down for us?
So the case of, invasive species, you see, they're outcompeting our native species. And, some birds do better adapting to an urban environment. They can adapt, which I'd say also in Connecticut, our birds have done very well adapting, being in close proximity with humans. And you see this, species that are more successful at dealing in urban environments will outcompete our native species. But it fluctuates greatly.
And we had one of our articles was based on the invasive European starling. It was by Dr. Julia Ziccolo from Hunter College. And what we found is that even some of our invasive species, such as the European starling, are declining at quite a stiff rate, and that a lot of the problems we thought were easily blamed on the invasive species weren't necessarily caused by the invasive species, but by other factors, including some human, induced factors.
So I want to come back to the migratory patterns real quick again. How do you factor other countries and overwintering risks?
It really begins, with identifying these areas that the birds use and are going to in the winter. And it's really creating partnerships, creating partnerships with other NGOs and organizations that are doing work in these countries, learning from each other, helping each other, and it's building on this. So, it's one thing to have very good protections and management plans in a breeding area, but that also needs to extend to their wintering areas where we can help and learn from each other, and ensure that these wintering grounds where these birds heavily rely on to feed and rest in the winter can also see the same protections.
And from your perspective, and from the conversations we've been having, it seems like they're all connected, really. And what can listeners do to not just avoid the areas where these birds are nesting, but even help these environments?
There's many things, folks, when there's legislations passed, here in Connecticut, our beach nesting birds rely on the health of Long Island Sound. So they need, healthy waters that will produce fish that the terns feed on, oyster catchers with their namesake. They're eating oysters and mussels and clams. We need to ensure that, we maintain the health of the sound. So, folks can even, help voting with specific legislation that will, provide protections for their food sources, support open space, with, also share the shore with these birds, give them some space during the breeding season, and that will ensure some protections for them here. And then it's working with our partners, education, in some of the wintering grounds, there are groups that are working on to strengthen hunting regulations of these birds, and that will also help protect them, and also coastal development in these other developing countries, making sure it's done in a sustainable fashion where we can also protect the habitat these birds need to feed and rest.
I was going to say, you mentioned legislation, and there's been a handful of acts I think that was passed over the years. Are there any policy priorities from where you're standing that you think should move forward?
Well, recently the Restoring America's Act, if we get that passed, that is going to be huge for conservation. That will increase the amount of money that the state will see that we can use to put toward our conservation efforts. And that would be a huge, huge leap and a huge win for these birds here in Connecticut.
And Patrick, I just want to bring this back to you too. What can listeners do to help protect environments besides just avoiding the nesting areas?
Yeah, as Elizabeth mentioned, Recovering America's Wildlife Act is really huge, and already, our members and people who are advocates for wildlife have reached out in droves to our elected officials, and it has passed the House, and now is just waiting to hopefully pass the Senate before the end of this session. Keep an eye out for, on our websites, the various, Audubon Connecticut and Connecticut Audubon Society's websites for opportunities to weigh in on additional policy frameworks. There may be some additional legislation regarding horseshoe crabs this legislative session. Horseshoe crabs are very important prey items. Their eggs and young are very important prey items for migratory and nesting shorebirds and other species of conservation concerns such as weakfish and bluefish.
And I was going to say for both of you, really, if listeners want to help out and volunteer, do you have opportunities for them to join in on that?
Yeah, if they go to our website, the Audubon Alliance for Coastal Waterbirds, aafcw.org, or just Google Audubon Alliance for Coastal Waterbirds, they can find out more about volunteering to help out with shorebirds, either on a regular basis, being if you will, a monitor or a steward, or on special occasions when we may be putting out string fencing or removing the string fencing.
That sounds like a plan. Thank you so much for that information. And from Connecticut Public Radio, this is Where We Live. I'm Catherine Shen. You've been listening to Elizabeth Amendola, Coastal Program Coordinator for Audubon Connecticut. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up next, we'll be talking about how raptors are on the rise in Connecticut. You can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Raptors are back on the rise in Connecticut. Here to discuss the bright spot in the Connecticut Audubon Society's State of the Birds report is Brian Hess, Wildlife Division Biologist with the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Thanks, Brian, for being here with us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
And still with us is Patrick Cummins, Executive Director of the Connecticut Audubon Society. You can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Brian, we've been talking about habitat loss and bird habitats and how humans should not be going to these places, but there is a major bright spot in this year's State of the Birds report from the Audubon Society. What species are we referring to here when we're describing raptors and this success story?
Absolutely. So I wrote an article for the Birds report about peregrine falcons, ospreys, and bald eagles, and they're the threats, the decline that they went through during the middle of the 20th century, largely in part due to the overuse of DDT and some secondary impacts from that. And then also just the recovery, the dramatic recovery that those species have made. After DDT, there were no bald eagle nests in Connecticut until the year 1992. That was the first year And then this year, we've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 nesting territories across the state.
Speaking of dramatic, that sounds quite dramatic. And can you explain just a little bit more about why the pesticide regulation is a very crucial part of the raptor recovery story?
Sure. I think that this is an important story to include in a report like this, because it really demonstrates, similar to how the connecting it to what you were talking about at the beginning of the hour, where you were talking about how the Connecticut Audubon Society was formed to address the conservation challenge of overharvest for the millinery trade. It demonstrates the ability of people, of policy and conservation action to align to address a concrete threat and allow a species to recover. So the DDT was a widely used insecticide. And it basically became a part of the ecosystem all across the state. Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station had done some experiments in the 60s and 70s and found it in places that had been sprayed, and it had worked its way into the food web of places that had not been sprayed. The animals that we're talking about, ospreys, peregrine falcons, and bald eagles, those are at the top of the food chain. So they're predators that are eating predators that are eating predators that are eating, insects and birds and things like that. So that toxin accumulates, and the effects of it is biomagnified as it goes up those different food chain levels. And it really inhibited their ability to successfully reproduce, to the point where in the mid 60s, there were under 500 nests of bald eagles in the lower 48 states. And when they were delisted 15 years ago, there was over 10,000. So you're really seeing a dramatic depression as a result of that chemical interaction. And then you're seeing, as a result of conservation action and policy, the ability for some species that are well adapted to really recover in a dramatic way.
And you wrote in an article, recent history has taught us that these raptors are key indicators of waterway health, pollution, and deeper environmental issues. Can you explain how raptors are only just one part of the biodiversity crisis?
Absolutely. I think that one of the things that we try to do, one of the reasons that we keep our fingers on the pulse of these species, why we keep paying attention to them, is that they are indicators. They're indicators of healthy water, of clean environments. And I think that at the end of the day, that's kind of a lot of what we're interested in. Is, I'm certainly interested in healthy bald eagle populations or osprey populations. But beyond that, I'm really interested in having healthy, diverse forests, resilient habitats that are able to withstand some of the challenges that climate change will throw at it, and clean waters. And I think that when you have species that are capable, that are susceptible to some of these toxins, some of these contaminants, it's important to keep an eye on them.
And you told The Current that birds can be a bellwether on how we're doing as a whole. Can you elaborate that a little bit? I know we kind of talked about they're all very much connected in terms of biodiversity, but as a whole, can you break that down for us?
Sure. Birds are kind of a great bellwether for several reasons. I mean, if you look at all of the bird species, they have evolved to inhabit every little niche and ecological crevice that are out there. So they're really spread widely across the landscape. And then secondly, you have them moving around. So they're they're basically collecting food. They're using a habitat at a scale that is really meaningful to us when we're trying to manage property or to maintain healthy wildlife populations. So it's an important thing to be able to keep your fingers on that pulse right there. Birds are when birds are doing well, I think that's an indication that the species below them on the food web are doing well as well. And when they're in trouble, I think that that's definitely a cause to pay attention to, to really sit back, analyze what the threats are, and how we can take collective action to make things better for birds. Because ultimately, when we make things better for birds, we make a more healthy environment for ourselves.
Just based on this conversation, I'm thinking I need to get some sort of bird barometer to hang in my yard. And you've also mentioned that the birds are fine. It's about giving them the space they need. Are you talking about ultimately needing to minimize human disturbance and land development? Like, what are you saying here?
Yes, no. So for I'm speaking about the species like bald eagles, ospreys, and peregrine falcons. They're a very adaptable bird species. They're able to once that sort of limiting factor that was inhibiting their reproduction was solved, they've shown us that they're able to tolerate some level of disturbance. And in fact, things like peregrine falcons and ospreys have really taken to some of the structures that we've built as nesting habitat. So we've created this network of cell phone towers across the network, across the state for the purposes of us staying connected. But when what we've actually done is we've created hundreds and thousands of potential nesting spots for ospreys. We have these large bridges that pass over the mouths of the rivers along the Connecticut coast, and we didn't intend them to do this, but they have proven to be really excellent nesting habitat for peregrine falcons. We have some areas where we have open space, but with big trees near rivers and lakes. And while we like that, bald eagles also have moved into those spaces. So those species have proved to be adaptable. Now, I want to specify that there are some species out there that are specialists. They require special food or special habitat, or something like the shorebirds that we were talking about earlier, where they have a really thin area, a real small area of that state that is acceptable nesting habitat for them. And they're in direct competition with what we want to do. So there are absolutely places where we need to manage that. However, I think my point was, a lot of times, if you're able to sort of give the birds a little bit of space, understand what they need, they're going to do their thing and do it well. And we just need to kind of to stand back and really a lot of what I do as a wildlife biologist is managing people, managing our expectations, providing technical assistance, and figuring out how to live alongside the wildlife in Connecticut.
Well, you just reminded me that I think driving down the freeway, I see birds and eagles nesting on billboards and highway lights, still talking about adaptability. And from where you're standing, we talked about protection and what people can do. But what can people do to help protect ospreys and bald eagles in terms of their habitats?
Absolutely. I think so. A couple of the things that we do is I would suggest that if you see bald eagles carrying sticks, that's usually a sign that there's a nest nearby. I would appreciate if you let me know about that. That would be wonderful. Secondly, I think if you're interested in monitoring these species, reach out to myself or Connecticut Audubon Society. There are programs out there, volunteer programs that can help keep tabs on things. Third, I think this is kind of the key one, is to give animals their space. My rule of thumb is that if you're watching wildlife, and it changes its behavior because you're there, that probably means that you're too close. So giving some space is a really key part of that equation. And then I think fourth is to kind of enjoy the fact that they're there. There are opportunities to go out during the winter and see bald eagles along the Connecticut River. There's the Chippewa. We work with folks at the Chippewa Dam. They have a eagle viewing spot there where you can go and see eagles that are fishing the water coming out from below the hydroelectric plant right there. So there are opportunities. Get out there and get engaged and see and actually see these animals. And I think, like, beyond that, understanding that it's really important to understand that these are species that were on the brink in the lower 48 in the continental U.S. And collectively, we decided that as a society, we wanted to make a change. We made policy changes about what chemicals we could use. We made investments in protecting and reintroducing birds to areas from where they had been extirpated. So I think we're understanding that change is possible, recovery is possible, but it does take a lot of effort and a lot of resources. So I really think, like, things like recovering America's Wildlife Act, which Patrick had mentioned, Patrick and Beth had both mentioned earlier, are really important things that will give agencies, non-profit, non-government organizations, conservation partners across the landscape the tools that they need to do important work to conserve biodiversity.
So I got one more minute left, but we got a question from James in Hamden that asks if it helps birds if we don't mow our lawns. Do you have an answer for that, Brian?
Absolutely. I think that by and large, not mowing is a great thing. Lawns are, generally speaking, kind of unhealthy monocultures. When you let things grow, you get seeds, you get flowers, you get things like that insects can use. And one thing birds do is they eat insects. So anything that you can kind of do to promote the native wildlife, native plants, all of those things are wonderful for birds.
Well, thanks, James, for that question, and thanks, Brian, for answering that. That was Brian Hess, Wildlife Division Biologist with the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and Patrick Cummins, Executive Director of the Connecticut Audubon Society. Thank you both for being here with us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Katie Pellico. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app, and thank you so much for listening.